Hello and welcome to the Things You Don't Know podcast. I'm Kirby Dubry, and what you're about to hear isn't exactly what I want this podcast to be. It was recorded before I'd really fleshed out an idea of what it was I was trying to go for here. So it's just me talking about some interesting historical events I read about somewhere. The book that I read about them and the sources I used, I'll put up on my Facebook page, which is just the Things You Don't Know podcast. And if you would please go there and give me some suggestions and answer the questions I ask, then I'm hoping we can make the episodes to come much better and more what I want you all to hear. So, what follows is coming because I promised you guys a podcast. I recorded this. It's not terrible, but it's not what I want this to eventually become. But for now, it's what we're going to work with. I hope you like it, and I hope you go to the Facebook page and participate and comment and let me know what you think and what you want to hear, and hopefully we can go from there. So, without further ado, this is the Things You Don't Know podcast, the things you don't know about American history. Alright, so let's get right into it. Today's topic is American history. And since I didn't have any questions, this being the first episode, I just picked some topics to talk about, a few events. And so we're going to start with California and how the home of America's stars may actually belong to the British due to a technicality that no one ever bothered to fix. You see, way back in 1579, Sir Francis Drake sailed into the San Francisco Bay, where he was apparently met by natives who offered him food and gifts, and by his interpretation, also their land. Historians had long believed that Drake had made it to the West Coast during his circumnavigation of the world, and he probably sailed into the bay looking for a passage between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. But it wasn't until 1936 when a shopkeeper named Beryl Shinn was taking a walk near the Golden Gate Bridge and found a hunk of brass sticking out of the ground that proof of Drake's landing was found. Beryl took the brass plaque home, stuck it in his garage, and forgot about it for 8 months. But when he remembered and got curious, he found it was too dirty for him to read anything other than the word Drake. So he took it to Dr. Herbert Bolton at the University of California, who cleaned the plaque and discovered it read, "Be it known unto all men by these presents, June 17th, 1579, by the grace of God and in the name of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth of England and her successors forever, I take possession of this kingdom, whose king and people freely resign their right and title in the whole land, unto Her Majesty's keeping, now named by me and to be known unto all men as Nova Albion." And it was signed Sir Francis Drake. So it seems that England owns California, and it's actually called New Albion, which everyone kind of just forgot about for 357 years until a shopkeeper kicked a brass plaque out of the ground. Fortunately, the British haven't pursued their claim, and they probably never will. But now we go from California to Massachusetts, and from 1579 to 1836, to talk about a woman named Sarah Tarrant, who almost started the Revolutionary War a full 2 months earlier. It's February 26th, a cold Sunday, and a British contingent from Boston, led by Alexander Leslie, is marching towards Salem to investigate reports that rebels are hiding a cannon there. Now, what happened in Salem that day is really only known from various journal and diary entries from people who were present. The best description was written by one William Gavitt, a young boy at the time who gives an eyewitness account of the events in his journal. As the British approached Salem, the inhabitants of the village came to the banks of the river, and many of the younger men climbed up to sit on the raised drawbridge that was the only way into town. When Colonel Leslie ordered them to lower it, they refused, demanding the redcoats go back to Boston. The British then attempted to commandeer a nearby boat, but a man named Joseph Witcher quickly scuttled the craft, prompting some of the soldiers to lower their bayonets and threaten him. Witcher simply opened his shirt and dared them to stab him, causing one soldier to prick him and draw blood, which raised the tensions on the river even more. At this point, Alexander Leslie again ordered the drawbridge lowered, saying, "I will get over this bridge before I return to Boston if I stay here until next autumn." And again, the townspeople refused. After a brief standoff, about an hour and a half, Leslie, realizing that local militias were on their way and wanting to save face with his troops, offered a compromise. He said if the villagers would lower the bridge, he and his men would march 50 rods into town and turn around and leave with no further action. The urging of town elders, those occupying the bridge agreed and lowered it. Colonel Alexander marched the head of his men exactly 50 yards into town, ordered an about-face, and began to march his men back to Boston to the cheers and taunts of the locals. At this point, militiamen were taking up position behind fences and homes. And now is when Sarah Tarrant comes into the picture. Sarah was a nurse in the village, and she was watching the soldiers from her window along the street, close enough to reach out and touch the British men if she so wanted, according to Gavitt's description. Unable to contain herself, Sarah called out to the retreating soldiers, "Go home and tell your master he has sent you on a fool's errand. Do you think we were born in the woods to be frightened of owls?" Apparently, this was one insult too many for one soldier, who broke ranks and aimed his musket directly at Sarah. She stared him down and said, "Fire if you have the courage, but I doubt you have it." For several tense seconds the soldier and Sarah stared each other down, despite Colonel Leslie's orders for the soldier to fall in line. Finally, he dropped his weapon and returned to the ranks, after which Leslie hastily marched his men back across the bridge and back to Boston. Had that soldier accidentally or on purpose fired his weapon, Sarah Tarrant would have gone down in history as the woman who started the Revolutionary War, and the contingent of British soldiers would likely have been badly decimated by the dozens of militia rifles pointed their way. As it is, the war began 2 months later at Lexington and Concord, the shot heard round the world. And now we jump to the end of the War of Independence, to introduce you to the 14th state that almost was, except the others wouldn't accept it into the Union. It was a state made up of 29 million acres of western North Carolina, and named after one of our most famous founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin. It was called the Free Republic of Franklin. See, after the war, hundreds of North Carolinians crossed the mountains to settle in the western wilderness, and by 1784 they were calling on the North Carolina government to protect them from Indians and outlaws. Not wanting anything to do with the far-flung settlers, the governor at the time, Alexander Martin, came up with the idea to dump the problems on the Continental Congress, and ceded the western land to the congressional body, making it their responsibility. What no one counted on was the fierce independence of the western settlers, and the actions of a man known as Nola Chunky Jack, whose real name was John Sevier. Shortly after the state ceded its lands, Sevier and his men held a secession convention, and on August 23, 1784, they declared the land to be independent. They convened a constitutional convention, and they formed a government that they called the Republic of Franklin, and Sevier was elected governor. Now, Governor Martin of North Carolina was not too thrilled to have an independent republic forming on his western border, so he moved that the North Carolina General Assembly reclaim the territory. But when he threatened to send troops into Franklin to do just that, Sevier responded by vowing to raise an army of his own to defend the republic. On May 16, 1785, William Cook, representing Franklin, arrived at the Continental Congress and requested statehood for the republic. Of course, the North Carolina representatives objected, and a vote was taken. 7 states, voted to admit Franklin to the Union, a majority, but 2 votes short of the 2/3 needed for approval. North Carolina continued to try to claim back the territory, even signing an act that promised the people of Franklin that they would waive all back taxes if Franklin just returned to the fold. But by now, there were other forces at play. Spain, seeking to form frontier colonies in America into an alliance for the Spanish, had sent a minister to Sevier, seeking his cooperation. Luckily, he refused. At this point, North Carolina, basically deciding to ignore the Republic's claim of independence, sent in government officials to Franklin, resulting in rival clerks issuing marriage and land licenses, rival judges handing down completely differing verdicts, and rival sheriffs fighting in the streets. No one was paying taxes, no one was sure who was in charge. Finally, the Continental Congress had had enough, and they decided that a new state could not be admitted to the Union without the approval of at least 9 other existing states, and with permission from the state that originally claimed the territory, effectively losing Sevier and the Republic of Franklin their shot at statehood. In desperation, Sevier turned back to Spain, asking them for a defense loan to keep his territory by force. But before the deal could go down, officials from North Carolina invaded Franklin, and they arrested old Nola Chunky Jack, clapped him in irons, and spirited him across the mountains. Of course, a contingent of Franklinites promptly showed up and broke him out and took him home, but the event made Sevier realize the futility of continuing on, and he and the other leaders of Franklin surrendered themselves to North Carolina, where their only punishment was to take an oath of allegiance to the state. Ironically, Sevier would later become a senator for North Carolina, and the land that was Franklin would again be ceded to the Continental Congress, who this time accepted it as the territory of the United States of America south of the Ohio River. And on June 1st, 1796, this territory would finally become a state. They named it Tennessee, and its first governor was Nola Chunky Jack Sevier. And so, we go from Tennessee to Texas, which turns out was the home of a concentrated effort to create a communist utopia, a full 70 years before Russia would fall to the Bolsheviks and become a communist regime. See, back in the 1840s, Texas was a very attractive place for people seeking plenty of land and plenty of independence, and hundreds of European communists fled there seeking freedom from political prosecution, all with the goal of creating the perfect society. The Great Communist Invasion of Texas lasted a little less than 10 years, from 1847 to 1856, but it shaped the landscape of the state to the present day. It had its beginnings in the European homes of the intellectual elite, where the theories of French philosopher Charles Fourier on communal socialism was a hot topic. His visions of small economic units called phalanxes, consisting of 1,620 people each, quickly spread to university campuses, evolving into a movement that threatened existing European governments, prompting France and Germany to suppress the movement with brutal tactics. Secret societies formed, and the freedom of the American frontier called to them, especially a place called Texas, a land with unspoiled fertile plains, clear running water, and forests heavy with fruit, or so the tales said, especially those of one Prince Solms Braunfels, who had visited Texas in 1844 and became something of a promotional guru for the region on his return to Germany. Spellbound by Solms Braunfels' stories, a group calling themselves the Men of the Forties vowed to establish a communal colony in Texas, and by 1847 had amassed the funds they needed to carry out their plan. A tract of land was bought, and 33 young men, mostly students, made the voyage, with the goal of building homes and planting a crop to prepare for the thousands who would follow them. They arrived at the port of Indianola in the Texas Gulf in July of 1847, and made a 4-week overland journey, during which time they camped on the prairie and sang, drank, and enjoyed themselves as only German students knew how to do, as one of their party wrote in his journals. They arrived in what is now Llano County in South Texas, and began to construct homes. They named their village Bettina, after a noted writer of the day, and even became friends with Chief Satanta and his Comanche warriors, signing a treaty with them. Satana even reportedly tracked down a band of outlaws who raided the settlement and returned the goods back to the people of Betna. However, by the summer of 1848, Betna was no longer the happy utopia it was supposed to be. They had arrived too late to plant a crop the previous summer, and a drought wiped out the one they planted in the spring. Plus, they ran across the same problem it would take Soviet leaders another 7 decades to discover, as written in the journals of a man named Reinhardt. Since everyone was to work only if he pleased and when he pleased, the result was less and less work done as time progressed. Most of the professional men wanted to do the directing and ordering, while the mechanics and laborers were to carry out their plans. Of course, the latter failed to see the justice of this ruling, so no one did anything. Betna was abandoned the following fall. But as it crumbled, a new venture was beginning just north of San Antonio, a community known as Sisterdale, established by German scholars and gentlemen farmers. Sisterdale survived as a semi-socialist community far longer than any others, primarily because its inhabitants were more inclined to discussion rather than the practice of communism. But by the late 1840s, numerous attempts at creating a communist utopia in Texas had been tried and failed, including a group from France who attempted to establish a town called Icaria, near the present-day town of Justin. They had grand plans, but when they arrived, they found the cabins they had been promised by the land promoters to be nowhere in sight, and they were ill-prepared for the winter of 1849, in which harsh conditions and a mysterious fever killed off more than half of the settlers by spring, causing the remaining settlers to pack up and take refuge in Dallas. One final attempt was made in the mid-1850s to create a large-scale communist colony just west of Dallas. Called La Réunion, it was to be the ultimate utopia. A French army officer named Victor Considerant was leading the charge, and arrived in Texas with the intention of purchasing massive amounts of land in West Texas, as well as around Houston, for use by La Réunion. But it was just not meant to be. Everything that could go wrong with the plan did. First, before he could buy any land, Considerant learned that due to misunderstandings, people would be arriving far sooner than expected. So he was forced to buy a small tract of land 3 miles west of Dallas for an exorbitant price, using up much of his cash and preventing him from buying the land in West Texas. Then, when the settlers arrived in April of 1855, Considerant found not the carpenters and farmers he had asked to come first, but rather artists and watchmakers, professors and musicians, all ill-prepared to cope with frontier life. Their crops produced only modest yields, and the homes they built were inadequate to stand up to one of the most severe winters in Texas history. And one of the first to leave La Réunion was Considerant himself. There was never a mass exodus, but by 1865, La Réunion had melted away, and today it's a ghost town. Although communal socialism was a dismal failure in Texas, the people who brought it over had a huge impact on the state and the country. From La Réunion, Texas got Alier Bureau, a famous orchestra leader, and Julien Reverchon, a renowned naturalist. And from Betna, Gustav Schleicher, a famous Texas Ranger and U.S. representative, as well as Dr. Ferdinand Van Huff, who introduced chloroform to surgery in the Southwest. And of course there's the obvious German influence found throughout all of Central and South Texas, with towns like New Braunfels, Schleicher, Schulenburg, and Luckenbach. Plus, the last little reminder of the European migrants' Great Plan, a tiny farm town just southwest of Sisterdale, called Utopia, Texas. Staying in Texas, and in fact only a few years later, in 1867, we come across the shortest war ever fought by the United States. It lasted 1 day, and was fought against an independent state located within the United States. More exactly, within Van Zandt County in East Texas. Because of its isolation, Van Zandt County didn't see much of the occupying federal troops after the Civil War, and it tended to resent the fact that they were under the rule of the Yankee military. In the summer of 1867, a large number of citizens gathered in Canton, Texas. Before the day was done, they had elected delegates from local communities, and formed a convention calling for the secession from the state of Texas and the United States of America of Van Zandt County. Following the examples of the Founding Fathers, they produced a Declaration of Independence, declaring themselves the Free State of Van Zant. When word of a new nation forming in the territory under his control reached General Philip Henry Sheridan in New Orleans, he immediately ordered a cavalry unit to Van Zant to put down the rebellion. When word reached Canton of the approaching U.S. troops, an emergency meeting was called. The people of Van Zant had not anticipated such a forceful reaction to the secession, apparently forgetting they had just completed a 4-year war that had been fought over that very thing. As the meeting progressed, tempers flared, a decision was finally reached, and Van Zant declared war on the United States. Citizens armed with rifles and shotguns gathered in the Canton Town Square and marched out to the national border, previously the county line, and took up position in the dense forest. The approaching U.S. forces, not at all suspecting to meet any resistance, were startled when they came around a bend in the road and were faced with sporadic gunfire from the armed ambush. Though they were still well out of range, the cavalry officers ordered a retreat to regroup from the surprise attack. Seeing the U.S. cavalrymen turn their horses back, the army of Van Zant sent up a victory cheer, believing they had won the battle, and they joked all the way back to Canton, where they converged on the tavern to celebrate their victory over the Yankees. Meanwhile, after settling their forces, the U.S. officers again marched their men into Van Zant as night fell, and all the way into town without any resistance, where they found the celebration on its last legs. They promptly arrested everyone, and took Canton without a single shot being fired. Come morning, the federal officers found themselves with almost 100 rebels under guard with no idea what to do with them. So they built a stockade in the woods outside of town and sent for a circuit judge. However, they didn't plan on one William Allen. Allen was an ex-Confederate soldier, and he'd hidden a knife in his boot before the battle the previous day. And he spent the next 2 nights sawing at the weak chain securing his shackles to the other prisoners. On the second night, a storm broke out, sending their guards in to seek shelter, and William Allen and his fellow prisoners escaped into the night, down to the last man. Not a one of the rebels was ever recaptured or stood trial, although warrants were issued. The army simply didn't waste much time tracking down the escapees. Allen had escaped to Oklahoma and later Arkansas, where he became a doctor, and by the time Dr. Allen and his family returned to Van Zant County, the arrest warrants and the uprising had long been forgotten. But to this day, a sign on the highway into Canton, Texas reads, "You are now entering the Free State of Van Zant." So, that's it. Those were the entries that I found that I wanted to talk about and discuss with you guys. So, Alright, well, that was things you don't know about American history. I hope it was informative. I hope you learned something, and I hope you liked it at least a little bit. But no matter what you thought, if you'd please go to my Facebook page, which again is the Things You Don't Know podcast. I'd really appreciate it if you'd let me know what you did think of this. You know, all feedback is good feedback. We're just starting this. This isn't exactly what I'm shooting for. We can definitely improve, especially with feedback from you guys and suggestions. And, you know, you all answering my questions over there on the Facebook page. So please do that. You know, share this with your friends. Share the Facebook page with your friends. And let's kind of work together to build this up and make it better. So once again, I am Kirby Dubry. Our theme music was Rotten to the Core by the Builders and the Butchers. Comes from the Free Music Archive, so go over there and give that a like as well. And that's all. I really hope you sort of enjoyed this, and hope to hear from you all. So that's all from me. Now you know.